Yes. Fantastic. Okay.
So I guess can go, right?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
You may want to be here, right? So you are.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the task force in the nature markets in launch of your paper, Nature in an Era of Crisis. I would like to introduce Marcelo, who will begin our speech.
And, thank you very much, Bo. Thank you for the Columbia University Climate School for hosting us here for this incredible opportunity to have our first interim report. Just to let everybody know here in the room and online, we have a quite exciting agenda today. We're covering a number of topics with an excellent panel with members of our task force introducing this content for you all. We'll have a opening remark by Rhian Marie Thomas from the Green Finance Institute, following by a presentation of the first block of information that we're putting on taxonomy and sizing of nature markets. Right after that, I'll be presenting the additional materials that we have to share with you, and then we'll invite our panelists to come and provide remarks to you all. So with that, please, the floor is yours, man. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody in the room and indeed online. Thank you, Marcelo, for the introduction, and to Columbia for hosting us this morning. Just a few opening remarks from me to set the context for today's conversation. And specifically, I wanted to answer the question of, why a task force on nature markets at this moment in time? Nature's rapid decay, it needs to be reversed. And at stake is no less than the future of the global economy, since every dollar, every job, and every community is ultimately dependent on nature's bounty. In some instances, the dependency is plainly in sight, such as the production of food. In most cases, the dependency is less visible, such as nature's contribution to our infrastructure, or in returns to our pensions, and the technologies and services that we consume. So preserving nature has for too long been at best a marginal, local, and fragile affair. More often, it has been marginal to policy considerations and market dynamics. Positively, this invisibility is now being overcome as recognition increases amongst policymakers, importantly amongst business leaders, and the public, that nature is essential, not only to our intrinsic well-being, but also to economic prosperity and to justice. The potential impact of nature's decline on our economic prosperity has been laid out in numerous publications, notably in Sir Professor Dasgupta's The Economics of Biodiversity report and the World Bank's report on the importance of nature to developing country economies, the economic case for nature. The critical role that nature plays in addressing climate goals, notably in its capacity for capturing and storing carbon, was made clear at the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow, where nature made its debut on the global stage as a critical ingredient to resolving its existential climate change challenge. The increasing appreciation by the business community of the risks and opportunities associated with nature is demonstrated by initiatives such as the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which both Finance for Biodiversity and the Green Finance Institute are very proud to have assisted with its launch and ongoing success. And just as the Food and Land Use Coalition has been pointing out the trillions of dollars in economic opportunities associated with more climate and nature-friendly food production. And finally, there is increasing public awareness about the state of nature that's being fueled by increasing media coverage, amplifying concern, whether about species and landscape loss, deforestation, plastics pollution, and of course the nature links with the ongoing pandemic. So these drivers have catalyzed a surge of activities seeking to protect, conserve, and regenerate diverse aspects of nature. Some are classical conservation efforts, such as national rewilding programs. Some are high-profile, internationally embraced 30 by 30 policy-driven style initiatives, seeking to protect at least 30% of our lands, oceans, rivers, lakes, and wetlands by 2030, an ambitious ask. Many more are seeking to connect the market and nature in ways that deliver nature positive as well as market friendly outcomes. And this latter category of actions uses a really wide and divergent set of instruments, from TNFD's work on improving the risk pricing and disclosure to new forms of biodiversity offsets, some of which are linked both to project investment and to carbon markets that are increasingly being used to moderate nature's carbon sequestration attributes. Policy and regulation are going to be an absolutely key driver, and we are starting to see some movement on this. I call out France's Article 29 on corporate disclosure requirements that include biodiversity related reporting. And also in the EU and the UK, we have new due diligence requirements regarding deforestation. That the world is waking up to the value of nature is a really good thing, as are the multiplicity of pathways, initiatives, and instruments being developed to establish such value and translate it into meaningful action and impact. But there is considerable concern as to the likely timely effectiveness of scaling some of these initiatives, and deep concerns that some solutions may do more harm than good. So the task force was established earlier this year in response to a rise in markets that explicitly monetize and trade nature. Making nature services tradable accelerates nature's much needed incorporation into financial and business decision making. However, such a nascent market is subject to potential monopolization, rent seeking, information gaps and asymmetries that will hamper price discovery and will affect investor confidence. But the promise of nature markets is clearly considerable and could offer a win-win-win for the buyer, the seller, and the environment, which all stand to benefit. The success of these new markets and whether nature markets become part of the solution or equitable or become part of the solution or exacerbate existing problems, in my view, is a matter of governance. Well-governed markets can channel investments towards economic assets that deliver equitable nature positive outcomes and away from those that don't. Well-governed markets can increase productivity, or in the case of nature, the regenerative conditions needed for natural assets to flourish. If governed and designed with a long-term public and environmental interest front and center, nature markets could deliver better, more sustainable and more equitable outcomes, and nature positive outcomes. Maybe we define that by using the IUCN World Conservation Congress's definition as halting and reversing current trends in biodiversity loss for the benefit of human and planetary well-being. But if governed and designed by profit-seeking interest front and center, they could lead to the increased destruction of nature, constraining all efforts to reduce emissions and efforts to improve resilience, and failing to fairly distribute nature-linked economic value. In short, nature market development needs to be deliberative, a collective process, and our goal as the task force is to ensure the robust governance of rapidly expanding nature markets to avoid greenwash, halt illegal markets, and deliver nature positive and more equitable outcomes. I'm very sorry that I have to dash, as is the way of New York Climate Week, to the next event, but you will be hearing from fellow task force members and knowledge partners during this morning's session about our approach to defining the various types of nature markets, analysing the existing and emerging approaches to their development, building awareness of the opportunities and the risks across policy, business and civil society, and building the basis for a community of practitioners, initiating and supporting Pathfinder initiatives, which is something very close to my heart, which we can scale, and then using these learnings, recommend and advancing standards of practice and enabling principles, which importantly are going to lead to supportive governance arrangements and ultimately to developing a new positive generation of nature markets. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for setting up so well the job we have ahead of us. I will now start introducing to you all what is the task force. And Monique, if we can have the next slide up. And as
Use it on the other side because your back is to the
sorry, my back is to the camera. And if I can just invite Raj, please, on behalf of the Columbia Climate School, to just give us a few words to why the university was so eager and kind to host the task force launch of our interim report. And then I'll go introduce the task force itself for everybody.
Well, firstly, I just want to say thank you to the task force and those that were involved in pulling such a critical contribution to the field together. Our team at Columbia are responsible for climate action, for ensuring that the university is able to help translate a lot of its research into impact in the field. And we know that we're on the verge of the biggest crisis that we've faced in many ways as a species, and we know that we aren't valuing nature the way it needs to be valued. And we know that that requires a holistic approach to trying to address that question, whether it's from economics and finance, or whether it's from those who are doing science in the field and understanding the true cost of using resources from different ecosystems, and that the implications of that on different markets as well as different communities. And I think having worked closely on questions around disclosure for climate-related financial disclosure, seeing how this is moving to the next stage as we look, for example, towards the meetings in December of the COP15, the CBD COP, recognizing that that's also a massive milestone, not just for the climate school, because we are also the School of Climate, Earth and Society. We haven't forgotten that, in fact, we are talking here about planetary boundaries. Fantastic. And actually ensuring that we are operating within a social floor at the same time, ensuring that there's a just space for economic activity. And for us, this initiative actually is iconic of an understanding of that deep way in which we've got to navigate the future in terms of the future markets. And so delighted to have this first step together with you, Marcelo, and others in the team. Very much looking forward to how we can more work together and embed this work with many other experts in the field and try to see how we can shift the market system to be one which really does truly value the true costs of its activity.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having us here. And if we can go now, Monique, for our next slide, I just want to make sure that I'm not in front of the camera so people can see. We would like to introduce a little bit about the task force mandate. And I was talking to Jason earlier, and we were discussing the very important piece of our name, the task force on nature markets and not task force for nature markets, in the sense that it's so important for us to understand that we have an emerging market development happening. And what we want to do is make sure that we can shape and drive it to be an actable, nature positive, and net zero outcome oriented. As Rian well stated, it is a proposal from the task force and its members and knowledge partners that we focus not only on the assessment for the quality, the data, the technology, but foremost the governance of this market. If we could go for the next slide, Monique, please. And I think it's important to let you know that the task force is covered by a number of incredible, talented people from very different fields, very different geographies, very different sectors of work. And this was a very important element for us to provide not only a diversity of views, but a diversity also of visions. And if we could go for the next slide, please. I would now like to then ask Jason Ellis from Vivid Economics to present to us the first set of findings that the task force has done under his leadership regarding landscaping and sizing of what are the size and shape of nature markets. With that, please, Jason, I welcome you. And thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Marcelo. Is this an okay place to stand, or
Yes.
can see the slides? Excellent. Monique, if we maybe move to the first slide. So I just want to thank you for having me. I'm very happy to present the first sort of landscaping analysis that's been done around nature markets, and to give people a sense of what we're learning and what that might mean for kind of the way the initiative is moving forward. So I guess the first thing to say is that the purpose of this analysis was to really just get a sense of where do we see nature markets today? What's the status of those markets? And from there to understand how we might think about, what does it mean going forward? How does nature and markets lead to certain outcomes, and what might be the implications for things like market infrastructure, governance, et cetera. So I guess the reason this was something we thought was important is not so much that we thought nature markets necessarily are something you have to promote, but that nature markets are something that simply exists in the world and at quite some scale, and that they've been growing, and that if we don't understand the dynamics of how those markets work, we're not necessarily going to get the kind of outcomes that we might want. Nature markets, broadly defined, and I'll go through a much more specific definition as we go through it, is basically where we see nature in its various forms, specifically valued and traded. So like other products and services in the market, where we see nature explicitly traded. That doesn't mean it's everywhere that we find nature, or that it's everywhere that nature interacts with the economy. I'll talk about that a bit more later, but it's where we can see a market dynamic already incorporating nature. What we've done, and what I'll go through now in a bit more detail, is try to understand then what's the extent and size and nature of some of those markets. So if we go to the next slide. So the first thing to do to really understand what the size of a nature market might be is to actually define what that market is. We have a very simple definition, which I think is intuitive to everyone. A nature market is trade where there is a specific price on nature that generates nature-specific revenues. More technically, though, you get into quite a lot of nitty-gritty of what that might mean and what the different types of nature markets might be. And so in particular, we're trying to find a set of markets where you can find two counterparties, buyers and sellers, that are transacting. And this might be both a flow, so products and services, but it might also be assets, that is to say, stocks of nature, but it also might be derivatives. Not everything, and not every market is based on the direct trade of a good or service. It might be based on a derivative value from that good or service. So we really wanted to encompass all places where nature might show up in markets, and to ensure that we had a robust view on all aspects of it. So let's go to the next. I'll have a chance to go into a bit more, a few examples in a second, but let's go to the next slide just to emphasize sort of what we think we cover. There's a lot of questions about what it means in general for nature to appear in a market, and I think often people kind of confuse it with the idea that nature is foundational to all economic activity. So what we're not trying to say is where does nature show up in the economy? Nature shows up in the economy everywhere. We are all 100% dependent on nature. Everything we do is dependent on nature. So that's not necessarily a very useful definition to start understanding a market. It's not where nature shows up in the economy. That's vast, but it's where it's traded. That's also not just where nature is priced. So there's many aspects where nature is maybe priced through regulatory instruments, but it doesn't mean that nature is traded. It's not part of a market interaction. And that's quite important because we'll talk a lot more on the panel about why markets in particular make a big difference in how economic activity happens. And so it's not just pricing, but it's where it's truly traded. The other thing that nature markets are definitely not is a place where nature is priced and valued correctly, right? So a lot of people think of nature markets as a certain subset where you've got sort of clear pricing of the value of nature, for its intrinsic value, for perhaps its contribution to equity. That, as we'll see in a moment, is really only a small portion of what we know to be nature markets. So now that I've sort of made clear what it may be and what it may not be, let's talk about what we started to take apart. So let me give you a quick sense of the various types of nature markets that we looked at kind of from top to bottom on this slide. So starting with asset markets, which are quite important. A lot of people would think of this as where you see natural capital essentially valued and traded. So in asset markets, there are obviously a number of real assets in which nature is very explicitly bought and sold. The biggest ones being things like agricultural land, timberland, but also things like water rights, and emerging markets like biodiversity IP or additional ecosystem assets. So that's kind of a stock of nature, which today doesn't encompass all natural capital, not even close, but is an area where we're seeing natural capital, priced and traded. Then you've got intrinsic markets, which are the ones that are probably most familiar to us day to day. The biggest are product markets. So where do we see nature's fruits, literally speaking, being bought and sold? So these are our hard and soft commodities, that are things we eat and consume every day. But they can also include things like legal or illegal wildlife, so things extracted from nature for specific purposes. And of course, they can include things like genetic materials that nature directly provides to us, or water and the rights to water. There's then also markets that are around conservation. So you're not actually trading something that gets consumed, but you're trading something that's preserved for whatever value people want to ascribe to it. So we see that, for example, in markets for ecosystem services. Sometimes you'll see other conservation type activities, traded through different instruments. And then finally, you'll get markets that are essentially providing access to nature. So nature provides a service, and that it provides a beautiful landscape or a wildlife park, and you might then buy access to that nature. So that's our second big bucket. The next one is credit markets. So this is where you're essentially trading credits that reflect efforts to enhance or conserve nature. So the biggest credit market in nature are probably carbon markets, which people are quite familiar with, and which you could consider a subset of a nature market. You're basically trading in a climate regulatory service, which keeping carbon out of the atmosphere provides. But then there are other more direct nature-related markets, where you're actually potentially paying for the conservation of specific ecosystems through a credit. And then finally, there are derivative markets. The biggest ones being those that derive from the larger assets we've just talked about, but others and really interesting new emerging derivative markets are things like wildlife, non-fungible tokens, or things like biodiversity loss insurance, or water futures, or things like that. So anyway, there's a vast amount of these markets. They're all over the place, and you would generally not think about how did they come together and what does that mean. So what does it mean when you pull it all together? And then I'll give a quick conclusion around it, and we can move to the implications with our other panelists. So in broad terms, and it may not seem too surprising, but nature markets are hugely dominated by a set of commodities and the assets like land and water that underpin those commodities. So by far the largest portion of nature markets today are things like the food and the food and livestock that's traded, things that we're extracting again and again from nature and using. And the corollary to that, the land or the timberland from which it's extracted. Now that's really important because I think we don't often think about those necessarily as representing an extraction from nature per se. And it's also not something that is generally regulated to think about whether that nature is valued correctly or incorrectly. It's traded on a regular basis. It's obviously priced with some sense of what the value of that nature might be, but it's not done in a way that necessarily looks at the entire value of it. And these are very large markets with huge impacts on nature. So understanding how they operate, understanding what you might do to operate them differently could make a huge difference in the way we see nature evolving and how we might deal with problems with conservation of nature. Around that, though, there are a number of smaller markets which are designed to be nature positive and which are emerging. So this is the kind of stuff I was talking about, like conservation credits, things like wildlife derivatives, where you're trying to create products that encourage people to preserve wildlife, and things like water rights. So it's a set of things where you're really trying to understand the value of nature fundamentally and put a reasonable system in place so that value can be recognized and incorporated into markets. But it's very, very small today, right? It's much smaller than what we know to be the established markets in which nature is already being sort of extracted and traded. And it raises a challenge and a question around how do you then go about thinking about the way such markets could be made more nature positive. And today there's nothing inherent in the vast majority of our nature markets that makes them nature positive. So what does it mean to think about expanding markets that have tried to explicitly understand the value of nature and incorporate in a way that Marie was speaking about? And B, what might it mean to take established markets and rather than thinking about building out completely new markets, taking markets that exist and reorienting them or potentially governing them differently to achieve nature positive outcomes. So that's the broad view of what nature markets look today. And I think the main implications in some ways for the task force work is starting with an understanding of how do you deal with some of the bigger markets, which are already operating and have a huge effect on nature. So let me leave it at that and hand it back over to Marcella.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think before we continue with the additional information, it would be very good to have, please, Professor Ilham Said Najad, a professor of finance here at Columbia University. Professor Ilham, what is your take of all this information coming from nature markets, which is a new nascent issue, and yet not really because of the soft commodities size of it? How do you see that challenge for the finance sector?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and also thanks the Climate School for having me. I'm actually representing Barnard, but Barnard and Columbia, we are a big family. So when I was reading your report, first of all, I'm impressed because it's like the first time that I'm actually reading something about nature market. And I'm also very pleasantly surprised this morning when I realized that the task force is about reporting on what is happening rather than advocating necessarily for this market-based solution towards climate. So I do have some some comments on that, and I do know that most of the focus is already on finance side, but maybe because it's my expertise, but also because we know that when we start financializing an asset, then the finance becomes the most important aspect of that, and then the governance is always trying to catch up. And that's why I have some recommendation about what are the challenges that we are going to face if this market actually grows and becomes the reality of, or our reality or our future. So at the heart of this market is to basically convert nature into a financial asset. So this means that we have to understand the financial engineering techniques that enable such a transformation. At the heart of every financial engineering technique is this paying close attention to the cash flow streams of the assets that are being financialized. So when it comes to nature, this means that then in that case, the timing and the amount of the cash flow that nature is going to produce is going to be extremely important, much more important than what it is right now. What is going to be the implication of that for the future of climate? So the implication is that then we are dealing with these investors that they want to receive their cash flows sooner rather than later, because as we all know, in finance, time has value. And I'm not very optimistic when it comes to the implication of that for the for the climate change, because this means that we are actually putting more pressure on receiving the outcomes or receiving the results sooner again rather than later, and that's never a good news. And I'm also going to connect that to the broader trend that is happening in financial market, where even the traditional long-term investors are becoming short-term investors. So I'm not really so sure why we should expect that when it comes to the nature products, we are going to see the reversal of this trend. So that's where the governance is going to be very important, and making sure that if this transformation happens, and if you start converting nature into a financial commodity or financial security, which means that a tradable asset, the long-term aspect and preservation of nature is the priority rather than this short-term return on equity, which is going to happen in the asset market, where we are going to treat nature or issue the stock on the nature. And so this is one thing, again, the government, we need a proper governor to make sure that this short-sightedness doesn't happen in this market. And that's maybe a point that your report can dig into in the next report. And because I know that you are going to actually put things into a broader perspective. So the second thing that I want to emphasize is that when it comes to financialization of anything, including the nature in the future, financialization and globalization are basically two sides of the same thing. So why? Because financial market is inherently global and international. What is going to be the implication of that for the climate and the preservation of climate? I do love globalization, but the reality is that we are moving towards deglobalization. And so what is the implication of that? The nature market, if it actually happens, and if we go towards the securitization of the nature, is going to happen while the market, the rest of the world are closing the borders. So we are going to kind of like seeing a phenomenon happening in the context that is not ready for that phenomenon. And I don't know what is going to be the implication of that for climate change, but this is certainly something to think about. So deglobalization is happening, but we know that that's a kind of like a long-term process. In the short run, that the market is still open, what is going to be the implication of globalization for the preservation of the nature? Right now, again, in your report, you kind of like touch on the issue of Ukraine and Russia. And we saw that like the fact that Germany right now has problem with kind of like providing heat to this to citizen is as a result of the connection between the close connection between Russia and Germany, which is ideal and which is amazing. But we know that in real world, especially because your report is also talking about national security, it's not very clear to me that like this natural, the nature market and again securitization of nature is going to promote national security rather than undermine that. So this is the other point that, and again, this is something that the governance is it's going to be very important, because like we have to make sure that like, okay, even if we are moving, even if that's the future, even if like this market-based solution towards climate change and preservation of nature is a future, we have to make sure that the national security is always on top of regulators' mind. So
I just wanted to bring your attention to the time.
Sure.
perfect. Basically, like I had maybe the last thing I want to say is that maybe something that your report can cover more in the future is this linkages that is happening across different commodities, and it is the product of the basically like a financialization. For example, in the past, the agriculture market and the oil market, they were not that connected. But as a result of this increase in the commodity futures, you see that these two markets has become so interconnected. And maybe paying attention to these linkages that is happening across different commodity markets can be an interesting value added of your already very fruitful project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us that feedback. It was very nice, and thank you for hosting us here as well. Wonderful. So let me just take this opportunity and just go over a little bit of the other elements of the report, and then invite our panel members. I think we already discussed here in many elements that came up about the important moment in which this discussion is happening, where we have a tension of nature and development and the scarcity of nature regarding, as you mentioned, Professor Alhan, the war in Ukraine, and what does that mean for our economic reality. We also have inflation and market inequalities coming up and playing a very critical role when we see food price, for example, and famine popping up so drastically in our planet. And finally, I think the importance for us to be explicit rather than implicit about the value of nature in this. If we can go for the next one, please, Monique. When we designed the scope of work for the task force, and we're quite ambitious as an 18 months task force that we pretend to deliver by the end of mid next year, we were looking at all these different elements of sizing markets and defining markets with a taxonomy, which is the presentation Jason just gave, looking into the legal and illegal dimensions, looking at the soft commodity markets, as Professor Alhan was bringing, as a key nature market that we need to address, as Jason mentioned, a $4 trillion market that we should look into, which brings us this idea that nature markets are not that new. We're talking about very old markets that we didn't realize, which in fact begs the question that many times we forget that 100% of our economy is 100% dependent on nature. empowering citizens and communities and consumers to this conversation. So there's a very important link of the task force, engaging consumers, connecting with technology, embedding governance, and addressing trade and investment policies, as we've heard so widely here. Next, please. So what we're doing next is looking at what we think could be, please the next one, what could be the upcoming opportunities for us to dig deeper into what could be a nature positive and equitable output for key nature markets. One of them we're looking at is the soft commodities market. It is a very important one because it's food related. It is a very important one because it is global. And with the crisis in Ukraine, we've noticed that almost any country and every country responded their own way in individual actions and not with a coordinated action. The outcome of that meant that in addition to the challenges we already have on logistics, on production, we also realized that by not having coordinated actions and by not having an orchestrated approach, food prices went up, inflation went up, and we have more inequality and more famine in the planet. This is a very important market for us that what we notice is characterized by what we call opaqueness, vertical and horizontal integration, and primarily playing a nature destructive role and not a nature positive role. So the question that begs here is, if we are to shape this market to be nature positive and equitable, what are the entry modes that we could address? And although we, of course, want to see new money coming into this, it's very important for us to realize that our economy needs to work for nature and people. Therefore, we need to shift the existing economy and not only looking at a new economy for this. Next, please. The other one, what we are looking into now is what we call nature credit markets. And a lot of people are saying, well, what is nature credit markets? And we're saying, well, imagine the carbon credit markets, and then you add to that ecosystem services, biodiversity, water. All this becomes what we call the nature credit markets. And although we're looking at this and estimating with the work that Jason was putting out as a $5 billion gearing up to $1.3 billion market, you could see that this, in comparison to the $4 trillion or $7 trillion that we were discussing earlier, it's a quite small market, and yet a quite important market. And the question here is, unless we have strong governance, it will be very difficult for us to ensure that we have the positive outcome and equitable outcome desired. So we're looking into this as a great opportunity. And most people, when they're looking into this, they're still focusing, and it's very important to do so, on the data, on the technology, to ensure that we have good monitoring, good verification, good reporting. But unless we have good governance of this, we'll probably find ourselves in the same struggle we found ourselves when we saw the carbon market popping up and not having clarity on the transparency, quality, and positive outcome for that market. So we're very vested on digging deeper into this as well. And the third one that we're looking at as what we call a deep dive is the nature crimes market. This is a very important element because a lot of people forget that nature crimes is a very important market. The numbers we often find goes anywhere from this 280 billion to over $300 billion market. This is a very destructive market that not only has a negative impact because of its direct damage to nature and people, but it does a terrible move of actually moving every other actor that wants to operate in the legal framework to become uncompetitive. When you look into nature markets that are illegal, every effort you have from people wanting to do it in the right way, they cannot compete because the illegal market unshaped that with no participation in the real economy, and with all the additional violence and destruction associated to it. I think we have a number of examples around the world with illegal gold mining, deforestation, wildlife trafficking, and so on. And again, here, we're calling for the good governance as a very important way to go forward. If we could go to the next slide, please. And therefore, we've heard a lot about governance, and I think that this will be, as President Elham, you mentioned, it is indeed the core of our next interim report. So I want to already get you very excited about the fact that in our next interaction with you, we'll be bringing not only examples of evidence-based governance on monitoring, verification, and reporting of this, but we'll be exploring a lot of how do you embed equity into this discussion. Everybody talks about equity, but we don't see much action and clear operationalization of equity. How do you really make it happen? How can you really ensure that a community in the forest is indeed being beneficiary of the incredible work they do of keeping, for example, a standing forest? We want to see also and explore what are the legal instruments one can address in order to protect. And then challenges like what are we doing in terms of engaging citizens? How can we do a trans-sovereign legal action in case you have wrongdoings? Who is the authority for this? What are the instruments for that? Does it work in different jurisdictions? How can you act on these transactions in a transparent way? Does technology answer all those questions, or it's a combination of technology plus governance? And all these elements are the elements we are exploring, looking at governance from a bottom-up approach as well as a top-down approach, combining what we call community-based and people-based oriented activities and strategies with regulatory frameworks, public policy, and so on. So with that, I would like to now invite our estimate panel for this conversation. I would like to invite Sandrine Dixon from Club of Rome, co-president of the Club of Rome. I would like to invite Jen from Nature Alpha to be with us. Rose, please, from Wholesome Institute. I'm so happy that you were able, if you would like to join me here. I'll open, Sandrine, with you. You've been involved with the task force since March. I know it looks like it was last year, but it's just a few months. And although we've done so much, we still have a lot to do. But for now, what is your feeling and what are your insights for this first interim report?
So first of all, let me congratulate the task force, and I'm an honored member, I really am. I'm feeling that the work that we have done has been so deep in the last few months to truly unpack what is a very complex area, but absolutely fundamental. As the president of the Club of Rome and celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth, you can imagine that our thinking is, first of all, you have to place a value on nature. And the trillions that are being spent daily, which do not, is the biggest issue that we have. It also shows that the over-financialization of the markets and the fact that we actually have commodified our markets has gone completely in the wrong direction in terms of truly putting a fundamental value on what is so essential. What already Bob Kennedy said in his Kansas speech in 1968, which is, we do not place a value on that which is most worthwhile. So the fact that this task force is doing that, but understanding also, and I think this is where we've had such rich conversations, the link between the social element as well as the natural element. The fact that actually we are looking not only as nature and placing a value on nature, but we now, especially through the Ukrainian crisis, can see the impact that not having access to food or energy creates not only poverty issues, but also potentially democracy issues. So I want to take this into a much broader level, which is if we can get this right, if we can actually place true governance, and this was the point that was made so nicely, this is a task force on markets. It's not a task force necessarily for markets. If we are going to leverage markets in this current system, which by the way, I believe needs to totally shift so that we have a purposeful economy and purposeful financial system, then we need to understand the governance of those markets. Maybe one last point is, as we are in a planetary emergency and the feedback loops between nature and carbon are inextricable and absolutely fundamental, and we do know so much about carbon markets, but we haven't properly unpacked the relationship between carbon markets and nature markets. Let me bring in the element of, well, two key elements. One is the element of speed. Because of planetary emergency, what I feel are the compound effects of what I call the 3 Cs, so climate, COVID, and conflict. The Ukrainian invasion that we're seeing right now, which is putting such pressures on our food commodities, but also then natural resources. And how do we regulate that now? So this is becoming an absolute urgency. At the UN Food Systems Summit, where I was actually dealing with resilience, working with Salim Huq, who is really the world expert on damage and loss, we were having deep conversations around how do you truly put in place a food system which is resilient to shocks and stresses, continues to feed people, has less of an impact on nature, and also will make sure that it remains stable when we are going to be in a continuum of crises. So this work, which may in some cases seem very technical and actually just focused on markets, is actually fundamental in terms of the way in which we look at short and long-term stresses, not only on our food system, but our energy system, and the fact that we need to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy.
Thank you so much. And I know you have another event to go, so in case Sandrine is not able to stay all the time here for your questions, we'll be very happy to forward them to you and ask you to fill them in. But thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. And thank you again for having me on the, on the task force.
Thank you. Why don't I ask Ivan for you to come closer, and may I call Jason for you to join us, because when the questions comes, I'm sure people will have questions for you as well. But let me bring it to you, Rose, because as we outlined, we provided on this interim report a sizing, a taxonomy, and we are talking about 3 deep dives, where we're going for looking at soft commodities, we're looking at nature credits, we're looking at nature crimes, and the overall umbrella of governance. The Paulson Institute, and your work in particular there as the Chief Biodiversity and Conservation Expert, shows that you will be highly engaged on this conversation, and you can benefit us from the view of having this indication of what it means for us looking into the future of the relationships of not only China and the world, but developing countries and emerging economies and the developed economies. I would like to hear a little bit of your feedback on that, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Marcelo, and thank you for inviting me and inviting Paulson Institute to be a part of this very important initiative. Since Paulson Institute's mission is really enhancing US-China relations, the relationship currently is in a very difficult situation, but we're still trying to do our best to keep the communication and collaboration with our Chinese partners. So let me maybe share my observation using some data and illustrate how important China is if we want to build a global, nature positive nature market. China has a very important role to play. I will use maybe 2 specific markets types to illustrate that. First is carbon markets. As you know, China is the biggest emitter of CO2 and greenhouse gas emission. So China, both government and the whole community, whole society is doing everything we can to reduce the emission, and the carbon credit market is a market instrument to achieve the goal. And since 2015, Chinese government started 7 pilots in different provinces to learn how to build effective carbon credit markets, and it has been pretty successful. So last July, China launched its national emission trading system, and after operating for 1 year, actually the outcome is wonderful. And first sector, about 2,100 companies from electricity generation sector get into the market and started this carbon trading. And total amount traded in last year is 4.5 billion ton, already became the largest carbon credit market in the world. And the plan is other 6-7 sectors, including steel, construction materials, cement, aviation, and so on and so forth. By 2025, all those sectors have to get into the carbon market. And by that time, the total emission amount will reach 7 billion tons, which is 60% of the total emission from the country. So we can see China's carbon credit market is very, very important. It's in a very early new stage, they're still learning, but we can see the market is playing its role. And that's the mandatory market, and also China already have some voluntary market in existence. It's very hard actually, but we need to build high integrity voluntary market using a strong standard to help that voluntary market also go very healthily.
And do you see the carbon market evolving towards a nature credits market?
It's part of, my understanding is carbon credit market is one type of nature credit.
That's right.
Market,
But I mean,
yeah.
but enhancing the scope to water, biodiversity,
Yes.
ecosystem services, you see that coming.
I see that coming. Water market already in existence. It's in a small size, but I see that growing. Biodiversity credit market is not in existence in China yet.
And
But we
once,
are trying to integrate biodiversity aspect into the carbon market,
absolutely.
promoting CC.
And in
Yeah,
that sense, do you think that if we as a task force discuss this governance as a wide platform, individual countries will pay attention to that and adopt it as a general rule for everyone? Or because unless we have that approach, it'll be very difficult to trade between countries, right?
Yeah, currently all the carbon credit market are still running nationally. International trade is not popular yet, but in the future, I hope it can be traded between countries. So I think it's coming. Yeah.
And the reason I'm just saying this is because that makes the case for why we're having this global vision, right? On
Yes.
having this conversation.
Yes.
And
Marcelo, so we have some questions that are coming in from
sure,
online.
I'll just give to Vian the final panel, and then we'll get the questions in. Vian, thank you so much for joining us. As I have to say, as a representative from the finance sector, it turns out that now we have to ask you this question, right? How do you see the financial sector looking at this interim report, and what do you think are the key elements we could expect as a move in the right direction of nature positive and equitable solutions?
Yes, thank you, Marcelo. And again, thank you so much for having me as part of this panel, part of the task force. For me, the report is an emblem and a symbol of a dream come true for the finance sector. And what I mean by that is, I think many of us, whoever we are online, mission-driven people who are working in sectors where not everyone has been thinking the same way as we have, but now these universes, these worlds are coming together. And the sorts of nexus that we're now encountering is, I think, literally the definition of a new era and a new age. So for example, if I think about 3 themes that I'm encountering, the first is financial sector awareness. So we had a consultation with $6 trillion worth of assets sitting around the table, talking about how to understand integrating nature considerations, nature risk considerations, and dependencies, impacts on investment decision making. That is transformational. It's like a renaissance. It really is. The second is regulation. Regulation is coming in, whether it be the EU, whether it be any other places around the world, very granular regulation around what needs to be disclosed and what needs to be considered. And so it's that quote, things don't move and then suddenly they change and they move faster than you could ever imagine. And that's happening right now. So I think we're all honored and privileged to be serving nature at a time when this is happening, where we're really standing on the shoulders of giants. But I think the final piece that makes today different and will make the application of the report so profound is that we have the technology today to be able to think about how we integrate nature into nature markets or financial decision making. And so the creation of a new market, it really is. And so the report and the governance structure around how we build these markets is crucial, because we're here inventing not just new technologies, but technologies around the system. This is an entirely new way of looking at life, but we're going to have to explain in a way that makes sense to the finance sector. And the finance sector will understand the scale of the opportunity, the mechanisms that we need to develop so that we can participate. And so that's why I think that the report is a fundamental step on the path of achieving the integration and influence that we all have been waiting for.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really good that you brought participation element, because that is one of the stream of works we're going to be developing in the next phase, looking at society engagement and consumer engagement in this discussion. But with that, may I invite some questions from our online participants?
Of course. So Brett Jacobs has raised the question as to the valuation gap. As per the 44 trillion of global economy dependent on the value and services of nature, according to WWF and WEF.
So why don't we get like maybe 2-3 questions online?
Okay, and then I have a second one.
Yes, please.
So Mirinetta Van Kalschweiser has raised the question of water nature markets, an area already underway for publication in the next phase of work. In particular, she raises the issue water brings to the foreground of governance across jurisdictions.
Great. And let me ask folks here in the room, if you want to think about a question, I'll go for this round and then get from the room. Jason, I think the first question could be directed to you, and the second one on water, I would encourage to have Gian and Rose do, because I think those would be different approaches to it. Please.
Yeah, so this is just the statistic mentioned by the online question, which is something like 44% of the global economy is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. So we mentioned earlier, of course, everything's dependent on nature, but if you start to break it down, the vesting was roughly, I think 44% or something like that, which is in the 40 plus trillion. And I think the gap between that, let's say, and some of the numbers that we're looking at gets the question of, what is actually priced or not priced, and what is traded in that nature, right? So many sectors today are using nature without it necessarily being explicitly traded, and very often not explicitly priced. And I think that points to a little bit the potential for nature markets. So where do we think nature markets could actually have a positive benefit? It's if you could manage to take places where parts of the economy are in some ways or another using nature. If you can make it more explicit that there is a component of nature that's being traded, if you can find mechanisms through which the value of that nature, actually both in the short and long term, to our previous speaker, of course, the longer the term, I think the better, for the purposes of planetary sustainability. But if you could find ways in which the market could do a better job of it, then at least you manage to have a system in which you can start to regulate and steer and try to get to nature positive outcomes. What happens today is much of that is simply outside of control, either within market trading, market participants, or within government regulation. So that's sort of the gap, and I think it also points to why an initiative like this is important in trying to reshape that.
Great, thank you. So Rose, water, of course, is a key element of any economy and our survival as species. What are the trends you're seeing in terms of water and nature markets developing that we should look for? Because we do have an estimate here that water rights is quite a significant element of this nature market.
Yes, so water is the source of life on Earth, so it's a very, very important natural resources. And according to my understanding, the water market has two different aspects. One is about the quantity of the water, and another is quality of the water. So for example, for quantity of the water in some South American countries, there are a lot of water fund established so that the user of this water in a city or in a rural areas pay for the amount of water they use. And then some of the money paid by those users can be used for protection of the upstream of the watershed. Another type of water market is quality, related to quality of the water. And in China, for example, one watershed, downstream jurisdictions pay the upstream jurisdictions certain amount of money according to the negotiations they reached for the quality of the water. If the upstream reach certain standards, then downstream users will pay the upstreams. So I think both types of water market are very important to ensure sustainable use of the water resources globally. Governments, I think it's very important, and government have to come up with some regulations to help market players to fulfill their commitment on this contract with this design with each other.
And I think that's a very important point, because we have been seeing throughout the development of our work how important it is to align public policy to investment, and how much de-risking of nature climate risk to the investors it means when you have good public policy. We have a knowledge partner in our task force, Civic Ledger, doing a lot of work on the bottom-up governance of water, looking at communities engaging and having the conversation. If we have a water budget in our community, how to handle it. Of course, we're still not seeing the trade of that with other communities, but within the communities, it seems to be a very powerful way to go. So with all these development, and you're so close, Vian, to technology development in the finance space, what is your view looking into the future for water as a nature market?
I think Rose and yourself have put this very eloquently from the policy and governmental perspective. From where I sit, I'm always the eternal optimist, partly because I think if you're a conservationist at heart,
I'm an optimist too.
Right? You have to be eternal optimist. What I've seen in the in the water-specific nature market space is really encouraging. So the first thing I've seen is water is not a new consideration. People have been thinking about how you invest in improving water quality and preserving water for a long time now, decades, to the point where now we see some incredibly innovative private investment opportunities which are live and being invested in by private equity companies. There are public listed companies where you can actually help participate in this. So these are, I think, ultimately solvable with a combination of both private market participation and government level, let's say, framework setting. And of course, the governance around nature markets will help that. The other side of it is this piece around technology means that, it's amazing how much visibility we now have on what's going on the planet. So using satellite data, using bottom-up technology to understand what's really going on the ground, you can literally map a company's operations and the water patterns of the land within which it's situated. You can see water stress getting better, getting worse. It's hard to attribute. This is the link now that AI is helping us create. If I can see a location of a company and I can see the water stress in that area changing for the negative, and I can also see that the company is consuming X amounts of water in this particular region, then we can start to get closer to understanding, okay, well, how does an investor start to influence that company and say, I've noticed that something's going on in this operation, let's say a textile factory in a highly water stressed area, or even more simply, Mexican beer brewing, moving from one place to another because there's just not any water to be able to carry on operations in the same way. We can see as shareholders, this is what's happening. Can you help us understand what we're going to do about this? This is a whole new level of transparency, which is just starting. So I have reasons to be cheerful, let's say.
And I agree with you. And I also think that if we look at also activities that are doing in the surrounding area with restoration and regenerative agriculture as a way to enhance the water supply, and how can you benefit and make those credits be shared by this?
So the investors will say this. So that often they will say, as part of an engagement strategy, I see this is happening. Could you help us understand how you're going to invest in restoration so that next time, next year, or 2 years' time, or 5 years' time, we're going to come back, do the same assessment, and we'd like to see some improvement.
Perfect. Let me ask you in the room if there is any questions anyone would like to post. Don't be shy. Take the opportunity that you have brilliant people here to provide. Please. So I'll get from Lizzie and then you, okay?
Thank you for this. It was really, really interesting. And so I'm Lizzie Tupiaso. I'm presenting professor and attorney in environmental issues, and now I'm visiting scholar here at Columbia. So I'd like to hear from you something related with how we can deal with kind of major limits, and also the way of living of traditional people that were different from the way of we live now, and it's complicated. It's a complex issue to combine with the scale and the timing of the capital flow and everything. So how are your tips or directions of thinking?
And I just want to underscore, Liz is the first indigenous public prosecutor in the rainforest forest, and works in a very challenging state of Pará with high deforestation rate. So it's someone that has firsthand experience, not only to nature crimes, but to the importance of integrating communities and so on. So I think it's a wonderful question. And if for the ones online that may not have heard well, the question I think is paramount about how to integrate a natural system world where nature operates with the financial system that provides funds for either destroying or regenerating nature. And I think both of you would be a great choice. Should we start, Jason, with you and then get Jan?
Sure. I mean, I guess my first comment would be that I think fundamentally it doesn't have to be a challenge of the underlying value that's created by those communities in what they do in their stewardship or more sustainable use and extraction of IP or commodities from the forest. There's oftentimes people will think, oh well, beef is so valuable, it's so quickly on the market. What these communities are doing doesn't translate itself into cash flow, and hence we have a problem from the perspective of how the system, the markets, and the financial incentives lead to more destruction rather than support what how those communities might live and what they might do to generate value. That's a problem with the way the markets are structured and what is converted into cash flow, as per our previous speaker. But it's not actually a problem with the value that's created. And so attempts to understand what are the value of those ecosystems, whether it's by preserving carbon from the atmosphere or whether it's from other services that they provide, vastly outweigh in terms of the actual value. But our problem is, the problem isn't that there's not value. The problem is that value is not being converted into something that creates financial incentives. And so the ways to do that, that are discussed, of course, and that have been tried to be put in place are all sorts of ways of valuing and pricing, those services. They're not perfect, and I think maybe I could talk about some of the challenges that have happened in terms of making those those things financializable and investable. But what I want to point out is there's not a contradiction fundamentally. All of the analysis shows that, you know, as opposed to the value of the beef that's extracted, say, per hectare, and what is it, about 1 head of beef per hectare or something like that in those communities or in those areas, the value that's there is much, much higher. So our challenge is really more of making sure that's converted rather than trying to, you know, to create a new source of value.
Thank you. I just want to really pay tribute to Indigenous knowledge. So having the privilege to spend time with Indigenous communities in Brazil, in Colombia, and in Kenya, just the extraordinary interrelationship between the elements of the ecosystem that knowledge presents us with as a different way, a different model, are something that I think is going to take time for us to all understand. I think the positive perspective I would share is that some of our friends, and you know this too, Marcelo, in financial markets are specifically not just understanding how to work with the Indigenous communities who live alongside precious areas of biodiversity and understanding how to make sure that whatever happens there is integrated with creating value for those communities so that they can continue to live in this way and preserve this biodiversity for us, but also thinking about completely new systems for how we run investments, investment funds and investment vehicles, thinking about it in a way that isn't linear, thinking about it in a way that understands that perhaps we are part of a system where we talked about 100% of the economy dependent on nature. That really means to us an understanding that everything in this room, everything that we go to the grocery store to buy, all the material things that we participate in as a developed world communities and developing world communities are dependent on nature. And I think we're starting to have a relationship that understands that because of the climate issues we've experienced, of the migration issues, the water shortages. So I think it's the very start of that. But I am encouraged that that thinking is being put into the heart of the most innovative investment thinking that I've seen anywhere in the world.
And I think the other side that I would add in terms of response from the task force is we're having 2 additional conversations in the task force because of that challenge, Lisa, that you're placing. One is about nature rights and the question about, can we really have nature markets for everything, or are there limits? And if there are limits, where are those limits? We have to have that conversation. The other one is nature personhood. From a legal perspective, when we're doing this governance, if nature becomes legally speaking, a personhood, would that allows us to have different legal frameworks to do better governance? And the third aspect that we're discussing is, okay, let's go for moving beyond carbon to nature credits. How can we ensure we're not reproducing the same mistakes that happened with the nature credits, which is the actual benefit sharing of that economy did not lend to the true caretakers of nature? For example, initiatives we saw on forest communities, indigenous communities that did preserve their areas, and understanding that by doing that, they would be part of this economic benefit of a service to us, society, and somewhere someone got the resource, but it didn't trickle down. So I think those are questions that we are going to address and face in the task force, and will most probably be coming out on our next round. If I may ask you to just get 2 questions online and then come back to the room, so we privilege the folks that are also online, please.
So there's 2 questions. One is, how can we ensure transparent and accurate MRV in African context? What are the implications of MRV for governance in that context? And then the second question is, financial institutions and firms are increasingly being asked to produce net zero transition plans in the US, UK, and EU. Does the panel believe incorporating nature positive goals and disclosure requirements into these transition plans, can they drive the creation and scaling up of nature markets that at a macroeconomic level?
Great. So I would suggest, Vian, you take question 2, because I think it goes right into your alley. And the MRV, I think Rose and Jason, if you could undertake, because I think, Rose, you are seeing MRV from a very interesting US-China perspective. And I think Jason is looking at it from a market perspective. So, and for the folks that are not familiar, it's monitoring, reporting, and verification, MRV stands for, which means when you have, for example, a carbon credit or a nature credit, how can you really ensure that this exists, this is really there, and this positive outcome indeed happened, and it's reported in a way that is credible and true. So who wants to start? Maybe you, Rose? Is that okay?
Okay, I will only share my observations on what's going on MRV in Chinese market. I would say because lack of data, especially high quality data, and also lack of third-party certification entities. Today, MRV for those nature markets are still not in a great shape as we want to see. But this issue has been raised by many stakeholders. So I think not only government, but also academic institutions, NGOs have been working hard to establish stronger and better data, and also have capacity building for third-party verifications. For example, there is a Chinese NGO called the Public Policy Institute, headed by this famous conservationist, Mr. Ma Jun. He has been building up data for polluters, water polluters or air polluters in a database so that everyone, both public, government, and business can approach that database. It's an open source database. So people understand who's polluting what, who's emitting how much. So with that kind of effort, I'm hopeful that in the future in China, MRV will be better.
And I find it interesting, Rose, because you basically disclose that data is not the issue because it's quite easy today to get data. Technology is available. What you gave us a hint to understand is the governance of making that visible, transparent, and shareable is the issue. And that is a governance issue, which is where we're deciding to focus most of our work. Jason.
Yeah, great.
What about the market?
No, very good. I mean, from the perspective of MRV, and actually even going into the second question about whether corporate commitments would drive change, I mean, I would build on what Jan said earlier, which is the data and the technologies to get data, to actually monitor what's going on, are rapidly evolving. And even though they don't yet give us global view of every aspect of biodiversity or nature, like at the flick of a switch, or they do give us actually large chunks today, much more so than they did a few years ago. We've been following and using satellite data, quite systematically since about 2016, and the amount you can do now makes a huge difference, and that really reinforces much better and more transparent, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And people who aren't aware, that's one of the reasons why you've seen so much really powerful, I guess, uncovering of greenwashing in some of the things that people have claimed about, nature positive or carbon positive programs. Because actually people can now look, it's not just some person went out there and signed a few forms and we all have to take it for granted. You can actually check these things, whether it's through a social media type approach where people in the field are actually able to report and get their views out to a wide audience, or through remote sensing. It's incredible, and it makes a huge difference in terms of transparency. And I think that point, that you can have much stronger real understanding and verification and transparency, is also what can potentially make corporate commitments more powerful in the market, because corporate commitments now, they are taken seriously for those that are making them, and they are subject to external verification in ways that I think corporates have not had to face in the past. And that means that they're demanding more transparency themselves, all the way through their own supply chains. They're demanding to make sure that they're not just getting something that they can, that something's actually making real change. Now, in the Africa context, because that was the question originally, I would say that it's, it's potentially a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, I think it makes things easier to do in Africa, where, previously, getting good information could be more difficult. They don't have as much infrastructure to gather data and gather information. It can help create more transparency through these things. At the same time, the same things that challenge Africa in terms of getting the right data will also challenge Africa in terms of its ability to govern these forces once they're set in motion, right? So, so we talked about indigenous people in Brazil. There are also many poor, populations, connected to land and connected to these ecosystems in Africa, for whom, transparency might be good in terms of saving a piece of the rainforest or the wild or the whatever it is, the savanna and the animals there, but they're not necessarily going to help them, economically develop, right? So even though you can see quite a powerful force coming in for good on the environment, it's not adequate without an understanding of how that's going to play out in people's lives and what assurances we're doing that the market then equitably supports their own growth and development.
Yeah, I think the point you're bringing, Jason, is quite important in the sense that, and we have this great partner in our task force, which is the Nelson Mandela Business School of Public Policies. It's bringing this equity issue back to the table to how to operationalize equity. And what are the systems and verification methods and data that we can use to actually ensure that, yes, we are doing this for the nature, we're doing this for the climate, but we're also addressing the inequality issue we have today. Otherwise, we may be serving a consumer in the US or Europe, but not really addressing a local need where the prosperity or the damage is being done. Earlier, Vian, when Rianne Marie was here, she also brought up our partner, the task force, for the TNFD for nature disclosure. And I think that it would be very important to remind people that the good thing about this task force is that we work with many, many other great initiatives. And the idea is that how we can cooperate and together make change happen. So I just wanted to remember that, because you're also very involved in these other initiatives.
Yes, and Marcelo, just to answer the question around climate and nature reporting and whether those two things are going to come together, they are. So it's already happening now, in that the Carbon Disclosure Project has added biodiversity-specific questions to their carbon disclosure usual reporting. So that's happening. The Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures is a movement that has started. It's engaging very heavily with the financial sector. The financial sector is responding. It wants to be involved. It wants to know how it can address these disclosure requirements. It's starting to try and do that. It's starting to gather the data to help it do that. It's putting pressure on the corporates to disclose. When we did our consultation alongside the TNFD on nature-related disclosures, one of the things we asked our participants who are financial services companies, what's the first thing that you will do if TNFD comes into play? And they said, we'll ask our corporates to report. So all of our investee companies, we'll ask them to report. So it's happening. And I don't think we're going to go backwards here. I really don't. It's already ingrained in EU taxonomy, EU sustainable finance disclosure review reporting. What's your impact on biodiversity, and is it negative? And if so, how are you going to report your KPIs for improving that? So I think the one thing I'd say, though, is that disclosure by itself is not enough. We can disclose, as we have done in carbon for quite a while, and I think awareness has been raised, but are we achieving the outcomes that we need? I think that's where the governance around nature markets is going to have its place.
To ensure impact.
Operationalization of positive impact, I would say.
Good. Let me then go to your question, please. It will be our final question, but thank you very much for engaging with us.
Well, thank you, everyone. This has just been so educational. I'm a conservation photographer. I've worked in China and high alpine environments for the last 6 or 7 years. I'm really interested in high alpine environments. I think what's fascinating compared to them, compared to the rainforest, the ocean, sometimes they're obviously less biodiverse or less of a carbon sink. they have glaciers, they have albedo, but as far as ecosystem services, a lot of the times on paper, they may have less, or they're harder to achieve wildlife tourism, so they're harder to value as far as tourism, or in places like Tibet, where travel is difficult. People can't even travel there, so they may not get the value of, you know, how do we value this as far as wildlife tourism. But these places, on the other hand, have extremely high cultural value to the local people living there. And so I think today it's very fascinating to talk about Ukraine because it's so connected with our economy ecosystem. But Pakistan, just 5 times more population, and also in a mountain environment. So when we think about a disappearing glacier and what that may mean towards a whole religious group or a whole people group, how do we achieve equity in our valuation of these places that may not have extremely high on-paper economic value as far as carbon sinks, as far as biodiversity, but have extremely high cultural value to local people living there?
Well, I think that's quite an open question. I'll leave for the panelists to do. What I suggest we do is, why don't we go, and I suggest you respond to it and also add your closing remarks. And just as a framing for the question, I would say, in the beginning, we said this is the task force on nature markets, not a task force for nature markets. So we don't think that actually everything has to be a nature market. And maybe you just gave a very good example of something that doesn't need to be a nature market, but needs to be nature valued and shared with prosperity, but not necessarily in a market basis. So let me start here with Rose and go then to you. Please, Rose. Any considerations and closing remarks, please? And may I ask Monique to put the information on the screen on if you want additional information and to visit our website, download the report. So as we're doing the closing remarks, we have the benefit of sharing that information with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo, and thank you, Kel, for asking that question because I'm from Yunnan province, which is in the foot of Himalaya mountain range. And I'm from a local minority ethnic group, Nashi. So culture really means a lot, and part of our culture is also nature related. I would say for those glaciers melting because of climate change, if we want to link that with the nature market, water is very, very important of the equation, because in Qinghai and Tibet areas, we see a lot more water in the lakes because the melting of the glaciers. So there is a big impact not only on local community, but also on the downstream of the watershed. In closing, I didn't have time to talk about China's role in commodity markets, but China is #1 importer of soybean, beef, and timber, and #2 in palm oil. So if we want to build nature positive nature market globally, I think we have to work with market players in China market, and also with Chinese government. Without that, I don't think we can achieve our goal. Thank you.
And I thank you so much, because I forgot to say a line that I love, which is soft commodities is part of nature markets, and nature markets is the 3rd largest economy in the planet. So we have China, US, nature markets. And that makes the case for, if anyone wonder if this is important or not, just look at the numbers, right? Please, Yan, your feedback and closing remarks.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a specific answer for you, but the couple of things that come to mind are 2 things. First of all is the great emotional connection that we all have to nature, specifically around mountains, mountainous regions. Countless people have been inspired by those landscapes and will continue to be inspired by those landscapes, whether they live alongside them and within them, or whether they visit them. And I know that we often hear this quote, "We are all nature," and it sounds trite, but in those moments, and especially through COVID, we all did connect with nature in a way that we hadn't before. And I wonder if there's something about that that could translate into our future way of looking at life. And it leads me to, in closing, one of the great indigenous trials I've had was living with some of the indigenous people in the Sierra Nevada in Colombia. There are 4 tribes there. One group is called the Kogi Indians. They live in the Sierra Nevada, and they travel to the highlands there, and they consider themselves the earth keepers. And it's there that they started to understand the impact of environmental change long before any of us did, and started transmitting those messages around the world and saying, look, you've got to change what's happening. We're seeing what's happening in these areas where we've been visiting for centuries, and we need you, broader world, to take notice. And they have reached out to the world to help us understand that something's going on here and we have to change it. So they're elder brother and they call us younger brother, and younger brother has to put itself together. And so I think these are the 2 reflections that I'd share with us.
I feel, Marcella, you maybe got the order wrong, because I'm going to end with much more mundane points than that, but thank you for it. It was a really, I think it's a sentiment we all share. In terms of the relationship of your question to markets, I think you point out quite profound questions about the boundaries of what people we look at here. I'm of the view nature is one of the things, but I think there are many things that humans value, and to the extent that markets can be a good force for helping us, more efficiently get that value, from the world and for ourselves and for our own thriving, then markets should hopefully expand to incorporate much wider views. I mean, markets today are a really amazing human civilization, kind of invention that allow us to value many more things in such a sort of an emergent and complicated way that we couldn't do, centuries and centuries ago, maybe. But they're still quite limited, and there's many things we value. Nature is one of them that aren't very well incorporated into nature. And the other things you point to, appreciation for cultural diversity of some kind, personal pleasure in seeing or experience a landscape. All those things are also not probably valued. I'm certainly of the view of the extent that we can, to the extent that markets can function to help us, optimize that for ourselves and for the future, then we should think much more broadly about kind of the spirit of what we're trying to do. So the things you point out about alpine environments, even though they do have some nature value, I think you could also think about how it should conceptually expand it. The other thing I think that's important and profound in what you said is that, at the end of the day, it's not just what humans value. I mean, in some way, I guess we're the alpha species of this planet, but there's obviously things beyond what we value that might have an inherent value. And so, let's not forget that it doesn't all begin and end with us. And there's maybe different ways to think about that. And so, like a bit of the humility that I was talking about earlier. As a kind of closing remark, I mean, I guess that kind of comes back into what do we think we can potentially achieve with nature markets. And I know there's been a lot of talk about we've got nature markets that already exist and they need to be better regulated, but I also do think there's a real revolution that we can have, thanks to the information advances, where you can, I know personally, and I think a lot of people know personally, that if they really did have the opportunity and understood the value of nature and things, their behavior would change, right? I mean, so many times we have no idea when we're picking up, food in the market or whatever we're doing in our daily lives. We just don't understand the impacts, and so we can't derive the value. So I think there's a huge potential for nature markets to be positive by creating that transparency of information and enabling us to make choices that make us feel better and that are better for the world.
Thank you so much. So we've been here for an hour and a half, and I want to thank everybody online and here in the Columbia Climate School. Thank the Columbia Climate School for having us here. This was fantastic. Being at the New York Climate Week, I think was quite important because this is an issue and an element that I'm not seeing too widely discussed, the elements we're bringing here, particularly the governance piece. And I just want to close by saying that we have an incredible amount of experts in our panel, in our task force as members that were not here, but their imprint are in this paper you are reading. We have knowledge partners. We have a long number of other partners on this. And I just want to encourage you all to read and comments, engage with us. This is a time-limited task force. By mid next year, we'll be done with our report. Our report is not about writing a piece of paper. It's about making change happen. It's about impact, and we want things to be different. So if you are committed to change as much as we are, we urge you to read, share, and give us your feedback. Thank you so much. Thank you, Climate School. Thank you, Pearl. Thank you to the team that put this together, Sandra, Monique, Christine, and my co-lead, Simon Zadek, that couldn't be here. And I'm sure if he were here, we would go till 11 probably. But that is the time we have. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you very much for.
Thanks for your patience.
And thank you guys for coming. Thank you. It's
Nice to meet you.
it's fun, right, to meet in person.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez.
Yes, you're wonderful.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to
You turn it off.
Every day.
Yeah. I'm very interested.
How are you? Very nice to meet you.
Okay.
Thank you, Monique, Christine.
I don't have any.
Are they still there?
I'm not 100%.
Wonderful job, Marcelo, and everyone on the task force.
Thank you, Christine. I hope your baby's feeling better.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to go snuggle her right now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Monique.
I will link you to the.
I'm
Great to have
interested to look over the
Asian task force.
Thank you so much for hosting us.
Because Lucy is expert on.
Oh, programs.
And she has a practical experience.
I'm gonna end it.
on
I'm just trying to end it.
what works, what doesn't work.
Yeah.